Hey everyone. Tonight we dive into the unbelievably high-stress existence of an Egyptian pharaoh. From marrying your own sibling to being blamed for the sun not rising, to sipping your wine like it might kill you, which it might. Before we get into it, go ahead and like the video and subscribe only if you're genuinely into what we do here. And definitely drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's always wild seeing viewers from all over the globe. Now dim the lights. Maybe fire up a fan for that cozy ambient hum. Let's drift into tonight's tale together. You've just been born into the most powerful role on earth, and you're already blowing it. While most babies get to scream, drool, and poop with impunity, you're being tightly wrapped in ritual cloth, poked by priests, and declared a living god on the spot. You're not just a newborn. You're an event. Your arrival is marked by celestial omens. Stars are charted. Sacred cows possibly moo in your general direction. Somewhere in a stone chamber, a bald man with eyeliner is chiseling your name onto a slab you'll never personally read. From your first breath, the entire palace is on edge. Not because you're helpless, but because you're divine. If you so much as sneeze, the royal astrologer might call for national mourning. Childhood? Not an option. No toys. Only ornamental rods you're forbidden from chewing. No lullabies. You get ancient hymns sung by musty priests who smell like incense and midlife crises. Your cradle is probably gold and definitely freezing. You're watched over by attendants trained to prevent death, heresy, or crawling. Your bottle-fed destiny. Your first words are likely scripted. And if you even glance at your cousin, someone whispers, "Fifth in line, be careful." Before you've learned to walk, plans are underway. Advisors map out your education, public image, and eventually, sorry, your spouse. Yes, probably a relative. Yes, probably with your same family chin. And remember, you're not just royalty. You're God incarnate. That's not metaphor. You must believe the sun rises because of you. It's cute until it doesn't, and the entire kingdom blames you. If you think divine birth means skipping lessons and tossing bread to ducks, think again. As a young pharaoh, your schedule makes CEOs look like slackers. Your day begins before dawn, when stars still sparkle and incense is already burning. No soft wake-up call. You're roused by an attendant holding a golden list of today's divine duties. Nap time? Never heard of her. First subject, hieroglyphics. Not your average ABCs. These are drawings of birds, eyeballs, and upside-down bread that somehow equal tax policy. Get one wrong, and you've just condemned a village to starvation. Then it's theology. You memorize the God's secret names, cucumber blessings, and how to blink correctly during sacrifices. One mistake, and a priest glares like you insulted the sun god himself. Next, math, not to balance a budget, but to build pyramids. You learn geometry so that someday you can supervise 2.3 million stone blocks into a perfect triangle. No pressure. Miss a decimal, and welcome to Leaning Pyramid Syndrome. Public speaking? Essential. You must address massive crowds who believe your words control rainfall. Slip up and grain prices nosedive. Then there's military training. You're 10, have never held a stick with intent, yet now expected to know how to invade Nubia before lunch. Strategy lessons include battlefield maps, river ambushes, and the fine art casually saying, "Smite our enemies over dinner." Philosophy? Not really. Instead, you're trained in maintaining Ma'at, the sacred balance of the cosmos, which sounds lovely until you realize it involves ensuring good harvest, social peace, and zero blasphemy during flooding season. And all of it is delivered by tutors who function as scholars, spies, and stress incarnate. By bedtime, your brain is overloaded with symbols, rituals, and enough paranoia to keep you up despite the chamomile. In most childhoods, Friends are the kids who trade snacks and grumble about chores. Not for you. Your friends are potential future threats in miniature. Every peer is a wild card. The cheerful kid who races you down palace halls, high priest's son, the board game champ, related to a general, the girl you like talking to, already promised to your cousin to ensure dynastic peace. You're not among friends. You're surrounded by lineages and political agendas in tiny sandals. Everyone's polite because you're divine, and their families' careers depend on your approval. This isn't playtime. It's diplomacy. Even your teachers file reports. Show confidence? Great, also concerning. Ask why God needs bedtime. Noted and possibly heretical. Complain your cousin stares at you while you eat? That's going on record. Privacy is fiction. You can't sneak off for fun. Fun is suspicious. Vanish for 10 minutes, and the palace goes on high alert. Gods don't vanish, even temporarily. And if you show favoritism, invite one peer to play a game, and 3 others write passive-aggressive letters and glyphs. Compliment a noble's daughter, and suddenly there's gossip you've chosen a wife, at 9. So what do? You become neutral, overly polite, diplomatic to a fault. You learn to chuckle without sincerity and admire robes you find hideous. You treat every interaction like a formal treaty, because if someone feels left out, their uncle might start scheming by breakfast. This is royal no new friends mode, not out of preference, but because any one of them might grow up to challenge your rule, poison your wine, or worse, become your in-law. By this point, you're not a prince. You're officially divine, not metaphorically, actually divine, as an actual God-on-earth divine. The priests confirm it, the scrolls insist on it, and the people bow like you personally invented sunrises, which is flattering until you realize no one asked if you were emotionally prepared. Every sneeze is considered celestial communication. Every move is ceremonial. And every mistake must be framed in a way that doesn't make the gods look clumsy or confused. But here's the kicker. Despite being called Horus in the flesh, you still stub your toe, still get zits, and still regret eating too many dates. Divine, sure, but not immune to digestive drama. The contradiction is dizzying. You're trained to believe you're all-powerful, yet you can't step outside without 5 guards, 3 priests, and a royal parade. You're said to command the Nile's floods, but trip over a cat, and suddenly everyone's whispering about curses. You're also tasked with maintaining Ma'at, that divine cosmic order everyone talks about. Sounds lovely, until you realize it means you get blamed if crops fail, people riot, or a seasonal fruit shortage ruins the temple feast. And let's not forget the rituals. Endlessly exhausting rituals. You must speak in mystical phrases. Your meals are pre-blessed. You act out symbolic victories against evil using ornate props under the blazing sun while dressed in sweat-trapping linen. You might privately feel confused, even restless. But you can't admit that because saying, "I'm not sure I'm a god," is the fastest way to start a theological crisis, or get replaced by a cousin who's conveniently more confident. So you smile. You bless things. You wave like the deity everyone needs. And somewhere deep inside, you wonder how many gods before you quietly hated every second of it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Being divine wasn't empowering. It was an exhausting show with endless stakes. You were expected to be flawless, untouchable, transcendent. Even on days when all you really wanted was 5 quiet minutes and a pomegranate. And no one tells you that the higher you're lifted, the lonelier it gets atop Mount Divine expectation. Then comes puberty. Your voice cracks. Your limbs grow unevenly. And just as you're adjusting to new smells and feelings, your advisors arrive with a scroll and a forced grin, saying, "It's time to choose a wife. Preferably your sister." That's right, your sister. In the sacred tradition of preserving the holy bloodline, a term that here means dangerously limited gene pool, You're now expected to marry someone who's either your half-sister, your aunt, or your cousin, all viable according to divine law, and completely unreviewed by modern science. Love? Doesn't matter. Attraction? Irrelevant. This is politics. You're divine. She's divine. And nothing screams legitimacy like saying, "I do," to someone who shared your wet nurse. Meanwhile, the palace is abuzz. Officials debate which relative is technically least related, like it's some spiritual word puzzle. The priests are thrilled, holy lineage maintained. The servants place bets. You try to act normal. But it's not just a marriage. It's the heirs. Immediately, you've barely grown your first facial hair, and already there's pressure to produce a divine toddler to keep the dynasty going. No pressure, kid. Just an entire civilization depending on your awkward hormonal journey. Through it all, you must remain composed, graceful, sacred. Because you're not just someone's husband. You are a symbol of fertility, order, and everlasting divine favor. Especially during ceremonies where you parade beside your new bride, who may, again, be your niece. In private, you may feel disgusted, confused, desperate to escape into the desert and scream into the wind. But saying any of that makes you look unstable. So instead, you bow, you attend the feast, you marry your sister, and you convince yourself it's all necessary for the good of the kingdom. Because what's a little DNA roulette when Egypt is depending on you to produce the next holy ruler, possibly with extra joints? This is royal adolescence, brought to you by tradition, questionable genetics, and emotional repression. And the only thing more tangled in the family tree is the need to pretend it's divine. Eventually, you're crowned Pharaoh. Time to bask in glory, right? Not so fast. First, they stick a false beard on your chin with beeswax and secure a cobra to your forehead. Congrats! You now resemble a worried statue with lower back issues. Let's talk about the crown. It's not some sleek, jeweled accessory. It's a massive double-stacked headpiece made from leather, linen, and occasionally metal. You're not wearing a hat. You're balancing symbolism. Heavy, sweaty symbolism. And you have to stand perfectly still in the sun while priests whisper about how the cosmos depends on your posture. The double crown is especially symbolic. It fuses the red crown of Lower Egypt with the white crown of Upper Egypt, meaning you rule it all. Beautiful concept. Brutal for your spine. It's like balancing two helmets and a ceremonial salad bowl on your skull. Now let's talk clothes. You're wrapped in elaborate garments, erratic schedules, not because it guaranteed safety, but at least it made betrayal slightly annoying. And sleep? A fantasy. You rested behind triple locked doors with a blade under your pillow, and a guard who practices best wasn't me face while on duty. But the worst part wasn't dodging death. It was acting like you weren't aware of it. You had to remain serene, celestial, untouchable, because any crack in that mask was weakness, and weakness was blood in the water. Every look, handshake, and too friendly compliment could be a step in someone else's climb to power. Trust the wrong person? Congratulations. You'd never have to deal with court politics again. Being Pharaoh wasn't about commanding. It was surviving in a palace where people bowed by day and sharpened blades by night. You had to embody divinity, wise, composed, and somehow glamorous in 40 degrees Celsius heat, wearing a gold chest plate and a smile that didn't scream burning alive. Public life in Egypt was all about spectacle. Endless parades through throngs of citizens who worshipped you, feared you, or showed up for free bread. You'd stand atop a chariot, waving like a sun god, while praying you wouldn't faint and spark a nationwide panic. The costumes? Not helpful. Cloaked in elaborate fabrics, weighed down by symbols of power, topped off with a headdress that functioned as a personal oven. Linen clung to unholy places. Sandals squished like soggy papyrus bundles. You endured hours of ritual, blessing sacred cows, slicing ribbons with a gold dagger, because of course, and accepting offerings from nobles whose smiles screamed tax dodge. You muttered, "May the gods bless you," while quietly begging them for air conditioning. The sun, it didn't care about your god status. It scorched you like divine vengeance. Your kohl eyeliner melted, incense smoked you out, and still, every eye waited for a perfect performance. Not heat stroke in a leopard's ash. One missed smile, one drooping eyelid, and the whispering began. Pharaoh looks weak. Pharaoh's unhappy. RA is displeased. Skip one goose blessing, and suddenly everyone's talking drought. And the festivals, don't be fooled, weren't joy. They were just more exhausting rituals. You showed up at feasts you couldn't eat, dances you couldn't enjoy, religious dramas where you played yourself and still had no lines. It wasn't celebration. It was Broadway, and you were the headliner. Always. By day's end, you crawled back to the palace, drenched in sweat and ceremony, wondering how many more holy cows needed patting before the gods allowed you a nap. Being Pharaoh in public meant pretending you were having a deep spiritual experience while slow roasting like a decorative goose. Outwardly, you were Horus on earth, divine ruler, master both lands, walking god of the Nile. But behind the sparkle, a stronger force. The priests. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were everything: banks, schools, farms, libraries, tax offices, and probably ancient Egypt's version of a data center. The priesthood ran grain, land, gold, rumors, and your spiritual credit score. You wore the crown, but they held the spreadsheets. Every temple was a fiefdom, its high priest a savvy CO. These weren't kind old men chanting hymns. They were robe-wearing politicians fluent in astronomy, accounting, and polite coercion. They managed the gods, the festivals, the omens, and, more crucially, your PR. Sneeze on a sacred day? Divine displeasure. With a wrong sash, Ra's depressed. Cue riots. But you needed them. Without priestly backing, your divine status could vanish overnight. Just one chisel to a temple wall, and boom, new prophecy, new chosen one. Worse, the temples paid no taxes. Holy immunity. They stockpiled treasures while your royal treasury bled out, unless you waged war, sold grain, or shook down traders. Meanwhile, golden jackal statues in temple vaults had better pension plans than your generals. The cherry on top, they acted like they served you. We lived to carry out your sacred will, they'd say, while siphoning resources, coordinating spies, and advising your rivals to consider both prayer and a coup. You were the face. They were the board of directors deciding how divine you were allowed to be this quarter. Challenge them, and you risked civil unrest. Obey them, and you became their mascot in eyeliner. It was a battle of power wrapped in smoke, incense, and side-eye. And the longer you ruled, the clearer it became. The gods might dwell above, but their accountants lived in Karnak. Family drama for most people meant missed birthdays or passive-aggressive gifts. For you, it meant plots, palace intrigue, and the occasional oopsie fell into the crocodile pit, because your deadliest threat wasn't some invader. It was your own relatives. You were raised among siblings, cousins, scheming uncles, and miscellaneous royal fragments, all convinced they belonged on your throne. Some were power-hungry, others just plain unhinged. All were dangerous. Succession? A horror show. Egypt didn't hand everything to the firstborn. It handed it to whoever dodged the most murder attempts and secured temple endorsement. Half the court speculated about your heir, and the other half schemed to block the wrong one. Your children were trained like racehorses, each with tutors, allies, whispering mothers telling bedtime tales about how the gods always picked the most attractive prince. Very subtle. Meanwhile, your uncles and brothers refused to stay in the background. Each had a general on call and an eerie expertise in making staircases treacherous. And the queens, plural, naturally all under one roof. They played alliances like high-stakes chess. One misstep around the wrong royal wife, and suddenly your wine tasted too crisp. Palace life? A golden perfume-scented prison, packed with kin and would-be usurpers. And funerals? A circus. Every death suspicious. Every illness suspect. Even coughing was a hot topic for temple gossip. Your own funeral wasn't safe. Tombs robbed, names erased, and your darling son might honor you by finishing your pyramid, then immediately carving over your name, because he wanted a taller one. Being Pharaoh meant the people closest to you were also the ones most interested in your retirement. Politely, permanently. It was a royal snake pit. So after a lifetime of rituals, anxiety, sunstroke, and strategic smiles, you finally died. Surely now a break? Of course not. In Egypt, death wasn't an ending. It was a promotion to eternal icon and part-time supernatural scare tactic. Embalming started at once. Your organs were removed, weighed, and politely jarred, each protected by a funerary deity, like a divine Pokemon collection. Your brain? Yanked through your nose with a hook, not because it was useless, but because tradition demands it. Then you're packed with resin-soaked linens and pungent salts until you resemble a revered raisin in designer wrappings. Your corpse becomes a political artifact, wrapped tighter than tax scrolls from your palace. Next is a coffin, or rather, coffins. Plural. You're crammed into a cascade of ever fancier wooden containers, like a sacred nesting doll, each decorated in gold leaf text and mystical spells just in case some disrespectful specters show up on your way to paradise. But the real masterpiece? The tomb. You spend half your reign and half your nation's budget crafting a mausoleum that screams eternal greatness. Walls engraved with sacred texts, prayers, and clumsy carvings of you pummeling enemies who, let's be real, aren't chasing you in the afterlife. Sadly, your tomb also yells, "Please rob me." Despite curses, guards, and trick entrances, most pharaohs' tombs were looted within years, sometimes hours, of being sealed. So, while priests were busy chanting over your divine remains, local thieves were sprinting off with your gilded footrest. But worst of all, if your name is lost, your tomb defaced, or your mummy ends up in a museum gift shop 3,000 years later, you don't even get the afterlife. That's right, one bureaucratic glitch, and you're doomed to haunt a startled archaeologist forever. In life, you were a god king. In death, you're Exhibit A, political loot, or a cautionary tale etched in limestone. And you haven't even made it to judgment yet. For someone sold as a divine being, your life was remarkably fragile. Being Pharaoh wasn't just temples and dramatic statues. No, it also required leading armies yourself, meaning hop in your war chariot, grab a bronze sword, and go crush outsiders before breakfast. Your generals wrote the strategies. Your scribes handled PR. But you had to physically be there, pretending not to panic, because divine rule only worked if the people saw you leading the charge, even if you barely knew how to wield a spear without looking like you were poking a stubborn laundry pile. Forget hiding in a tent like some medieval king. You were expected to ride front and center, swinging a ceremonial axe and shouting divine slogans. Something like, "The gods will destroy you," while secretly praying the enemy lacked competent archers this season. Even if you won, you couldn't be quiet about it. You had to return with captives, treasure, and enough severed hands to keep temple accountants thrilled. All paraded down the streets as you smiled. Try to look both grateful and terrifying. But if you lost, that was catastrophic, because pharaohs don't lose. Get injured, shamed, or, R.A. forbid, retreat, and the priest might call divine disfavor. Or worse, reason to swap you out for someone less cursed. So you're stuck in a loop. Raise taxes to fund a war. Fight to protect your divine brand. Then build a monument to exaggerate your victory, so people don't notice you nearly died. It's pricey, exhausting, and terrible for stress. And here's the twist. Even if you didn't want to fight, often you had no say. The generals insisted. The advisors insisted. The god sent a dream. Or the priest got bored and decided it was time to smite something again. You weren't just Pharaoh. You were the PR team for military aggression. And if you didn't win, you'd better hope for a fast burial, because failed divine warriors don't get flattering biographies. After all the holy rites, brutal warfare, scheming siblings, and linen-wrapped anxiety, you'd think history would at least applaud. But no, the final insult of being Pharaoh, your legacy wasn't yours. You could build the grandest temple, stamp your name on every obelisk, and bury yourself in mountains of gold. But one ambitious heir with a chisel and poof, you never existed. Names scratched out, statues repurposed, glories handed to your great-nephew who ruled for 6 weeks and called himself Son of the Sun, and incredibly awesome. Erasing a name wasn't petty. It was soul murder. In ancient Egypt, if no one said your name, your soul couldn't enter the afterlife. You weren't just forgotten. You were banished, because your descendant wanted your pyramid budget. And if they didn't erase you, they might rewrite you. Your embarrassing defeat, now a glorious conquest. Your quiet nature, now unshakable valor. That incident with the crocodile, deleted. Later generations treated your biography like a group assignment. They skimmed at the last minute. You weren't remembered for who you were, but for how well your memory boosted the next guy's resume. And for some, the worst indignity came centuries later, when their well-guarded tombs were cracked open by archaeologists who immediately put the mummy under fluorescent lights and boxed their fingernails for display. That golden coffin you prepped for eternity, it's now a school field trip stop. Your royal toenails, tagged, filed, maybe even sold as novelty keychains. You ruled an empire. You were divine. And now, you're a dusty exhibit in a tempted control case, while tourists butcher your name and wonder if your curse is legit. So yes, you were Ra's chosen, Lord of 2 lands, divine order made flesh. And your final reward? A misleading travel blog 3,000 years later. Harold Sigurdsson came screaming into the world in 1015, probably into a kingdom already burning. Norway was in chaos. His half-brother Olaf Haraldsson was fighting, tooth and axe, to unify the country under one crown. It wasn't going smoothly. The nobles hated Olaf. The Danes wanted him dead. And ancient pagan beliefs were crumbling under the weight of Christian kingship. So, baby Harold didn't arrive in peace, but into a whirlwind of swords, fragile truces, and bloody vendettas. His family wasn't typical either. His father, Sigurdsir, was a minor king, more farmer than fighter, but respected and rich. His mother, Asta Gudbrandsdatter, was a family's political dynamite, cunning, devout, and deeply Christian. And most critically, she was the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, soon to be Street Olaf, that made Harold royal by birth and fated by blood, a younger brother who grew up watching a warlord try to forge a nation. From the start, Harold wasn't raised as a boy who might one day matter. He was trained like a future piece in a game already soaked in blood. By 10, he could wield a sword. By 11, he could ride. And by 15, he was riding to war. Yes, 15. That's the year Olaf returned from exile in 1030 to retake his crown from Danish usurpers. He gathered a ragtag force of loyalists and marched to a doomed clash at the Battle of Stiklestad. And guess who rode with him? Harold. At just 15, Harold rode beside his legendary brother into the jaws of a superior army. No divine armor, no glorious banners. Just a teenager in chainmail, full of idealism and lacking survival instinct. The battle was a disaster. Olaf was killed. Harold, wounded and likely in shock, was forced to flee into the mountains with what remained of the army. From that moment on, Harold was no longer a child. He became a fugitive, a survivor, a man forged by failure. The Viking prince stepped onto the world stage not in triumph, but in retreat and blood. This wasn't the end of Harold's saga. It was merely the beginning. After Stiklestad, Harold didn't vanish. He withdrew, wounded and mourning. He escaped eastward, across the icy backbone of Scandinavia and into sprawling woods and winding rivers of Kievan Rus. For most Norwegians, that would be exile. For Harold, it was rebirth. At the time, Kievan Rus was an emerging power, Slavic in root, Norse in spirit, Byzantine in style, ruled by Yaroslav the Wise. Lucky for Harold, Yaroslav had a weakness for well-connected Viking royalty. Luckier still, his court was already full of Norse warriors. Harold blended in easily, but this wasn't some pampered palace day. Harold enlisted and he fought. Raiders, nomads of the steppe, rebellious lords, Harold faced them all. He earned his silver and his scars. Yaroslav was so impressed, he gave Harold command of men within a year. And perhaps Harold fell for one of Yaroslav's daughters, but more on that later. The young Viking's legend grew. He was tall, ruthless, and tactically sharp. Where others charged blindly into battle, Harold flanked, tricked, and struck when it counted. His men learned discipline. His enemies learned fear. Harold was no longer just a displaced teen prince. He was now a strategist, a warlord without a realm or ruler, shaped by loss, driven by ambition. But Rus wasn't his final chapter. It was just a forge. In the late 1030s, Harold's eyes turned south to Constantinople, the richest city in the known world, wrapped in walls taller than the mountains of Norway, overflowing with gold, intrigue, and ceaseless war. The Byzantine emperor needed warriors. Harold needed a future. A bargain waited. So he left Yaroslav's court and traveled to the city the Norse called Miklagard, the great city, not as a pilgrim, but as a recruit for the most feared mercenary corps of the medieval age, the Varangian Guard. This wasn't just a job. It was a slow conquest from within. Harold was about to become one of the empire's deadliest weapons. When Harold arrived in Constantinople in the early 1040s, he stepped into a world where even wealthy Norsemen looked like peasants. The city shimmered with domes, marble, silk, and secrets. It was the Byzantine Empire's core, and Harold wanted a share. He joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit made of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries. Their duty: protect the emperor, fight in his wars, and keep a sharp axe ready for political betrayals. Harold wasn't just another wild northerner. He rose fast. His size, his brain, and his ferocity made him stand out. He didn't just endure Byzantium. He conquered it. Over the next years, Harold Hardrada became a thunderstorm made flesh. He fought Arab rebels in Sicily. He crushed pirates in the Aegean. He marched through Anatolia, reached the Holy Land, even bathed in the Jordan River, where legend says he vowed to one day rule a kingdom. But Harold wasn't only swinging his sword. He observed, he studied, he schemed. Byzantine politics were a nest of vipers, generals, courtiers, eunuchs, all smiling as they slipped knives into each other's backs. Harold couldn't out-scheme them, but he could outlast them. He survived emperor swaps, riots, and quiet coups, and he kept rising. He also grew incredibly rich: loot, bribes, rewards. Some say he had treasure in Constantinople to retrieve later. He wore silk now, not wool, gold, not iron. This was no longer the boy who fled Stiklestad. This was a battle-tested commander, more Byzantine than most Greeks. But Harold wasn't meant to guard someone else's throne forever. And when the emperor began to see him as a rival, too wealthy, too connected, Harold chose exile. He escaped the empire the same way he survived everything else, with courage, muscle, and pure Viking grit. After nearly a decade serving emperors, he would now serve himself. Next destination, home, Norway. And this time, he wasn't coming to plead. He was coming to reign. By 1045, Harald Hardrada was done being a hired sword. He came back to Scandinavia a hardened general, gleaming with Byzantine gold. Trailing elite mercenaries and bringing enough war experience to shame most monarchs, Harald returned. But Norway wasn't throwing a feast in his honor. At the time, the throne was already held by Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Harald's half-brother, Saint Olaf. Magnus had kept control of the kingdom fairly well. He was young, respected, and ruled both Norway and Denmark, but he lacked Harald's battle scars, Harald's immense fortune, and Harald's burning ambition. So Harald did what any veteran Viking would. He built an army. Using his Byzantine gold stash, Harald pulled warriors from Russes in Sweden. Then he cut a deal with Sweyn Estridsson, Magnus' rival in Denmark. Harald would help Sweyn take Denmark, and Sweyn would back Harald's bid for Norway. It was a clumsy medieval alliance fueled by mutual spite and oaths. But Harald didn't have to invade. Magnus, reading the room and avoiding bloodshed, made a stunning offer. He invited Harald to share the throne. It was a tense truce, a shared crown between a seasoned warrior and a political prince. Think lion forced to live with a lamb. Harald was not the lamb. By 1047, just 2 years into their shaky rule, Magnus died. Some said illness, others murmured poison. Harald barely paused to grieve. He claimed full power in Norway immediately and made it clear. He now ruled alone. But Norway wasn't enough. He had eyes on Denmark. Thus began 20 years of savage clashes between Harald and Sweyn. He raided, pillaged, attacked. The same fire he'd once unleashed on Arab strongholds now lit up Danish coasts. Towns burned, fleets were stolen, and villages stripped bare. Still, Harald couldn't hold Denmark. It slipped through his grasp. Sweyn endured. Denmark resisted. Yet Norway was his, and he ruled it like a man who had spilled blood for the right to wear its crown. But England still haunted him. His gaze turned westward. By the late 1040s, Harald was king, not just of a kingdom, but as the final, legendary Viking monarch. He ruled with Byzantine discipline, Rus brutality, and the hunger of someone who had tasted defeat. His reign was anything but mild. He raised taxes, centralized rule, and crushed opposition. Those who challenged him either submitted or vanished. His riches kept a standing army and navy afloat, a rare feat for Norway's kings. He minted currency, built churches, and dragged Norway into the spotlight. No longer a fringe realm, it had fangs. But Harald's style of kingship was pure medieval hardball. He demanded loyalty, but only after surrender. He wanted peace, but on his terms. If a noble stepped out of line, soldiers followed. If peasants resisted taxes, swords answered. He wasn't cruel, just a Viking ruler with empire dreams. And the Norwegians weren't ready. Still, there was more to him than war. Harald wrote poetry, yes, often about himself, and backed skalds who turned his feats into verse. He maintained long-distance trade, reconnected with Byzantium, and kept his treasure links alive. But he never let go of Denmark. Every summer, without fail, he launched new raids. He'd descend on Danish shores, torch towns, mock Sweyn, like it was a yearly spore vengeance. These weren't conquests anymore, just ego battles. Harald couldn't quit. Sweyn wouldn't die. But Harald felt age creeping in. By the 1060s, he began grooming his son, Olaf Kyrre, to inherit. He probably imagined decades more rule, then death in bed, surrounded by gold and loyal blades. But then came 1066, a year of total English chaos. Edward the Confessor had died, without a successor, claiming to merge in Harold, now gray but fierce, saw one last opening. Not just Norway, not just Denmark. He wanted England. 1066 wasn't just any year. It was a year, a line between kings and corpses. And Harold Hardrada, nearly 50 but still ferocious, was ready to gamble it all. Edward had died childless. Harold Godwin's son claimed the throne. William of Normandy prepared an invasion. Then Harold entered, because why wouldn't he? He claimed a right through a murky pact with King Canute. Legally shaky? Yes. But Viking math said, claim plus army equals crown. And Harold had an army. He teamed up with Tostig Godwin's son, bitter exile brother to the English king. Tostig offered support. Harold promised blood. With 300 longships and 10,000 warriors, he crossed the North Sea, retracing ancient Viking routes. But this was no raid. It was full-on invasion. In September 1066, he landed near the Humber and marched toward York. England was caught flat-footed. At Fulford, Harold annihilated a makeshift force under the Northern Earls. Northern England fell open. York surrendered. Viking thunder had returned. Harold felt unstoppable. This wasn't a labyrinth of Byzantium or Danish stalemates. This was war, raw and ruthless. He camped at Stamford Bridge, demanding hostages. But then came the twist. Harold Godwin's son forced marched his army from London in under a week. On September 25th, he reached Stamford Bridge, catching the Vikings totally off guard. Many Norsemen had left armor at camp, expecting talks, not bloodshed. The clash was savage. The Vikings fought with fury, but were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and unready. A lone berserker reportedly blocked the bridge, buying precious minutes. But even Viking fury had limits. In the chaos, Harold was struck in the throat by an arrow. The Storm King died fighting, sword in hand. It was the last true Viking assault on England, and with Harold's fall, the Viking age breathed its last. September 25th, 1066, Harold Hardrada died in a muddy field by Stamford Bridge. With him died the final Viking dream of conquest. It was meant to be a diplomatic day. Harold had left his armor behind, glowing in the aftermath of Fulford's triumph. His troops were at ease. The breeze was calm. England seemed ready to fall. Then the dust rose. Harold Godwin's son had achieved one of the swiftest troop advances in medieval records. He and his force had covered almost 200 miles in less than 4 days. And they didn't sneak in. The English blindsided the Norwegians, who were scattered, vulnerable, and mostly unequipped. What came next wasn't a fight. It was a massacre. Still, the Norse didn't fold. They fought with the fierce hopelessness of men who knew escape was no longer an option. One lone soldier held the bridge with an enormous axe, stalling the English and becoming a legend on the spot. He reportedly felled over 40 warriors before a spear found him from beneath the bridge. That's how grim it was. Monarchs relying on bridge-guarding madmen to stall doom. Harold, grasping the situation, rushed to form a shield wall. But it was chaos. Soldiers appeared in pairs, many without mail, diving into ranks as arrows poured. Then came the English cavalry, hammering the flanks. The Norse line held briefly. Harold fought like the berserker he had once trained to be. Legend says he wielded a giant sword with both arms, towering above his fighters like a god of war. He slew, raged, and bled. Then a shaft flew right through his throat, and the last true Viking monarch dropped without a word. When the ship reinforcements arrived under Einstein Aura, Harold's banner carrier, it was too late. All they found was a field strewn with the dead. Einstein perished during what became Orastorm, a desperate, failed push that only spilled more Norse blood into English earth. Out of Harold's vast fleet of 300 ships, Only 24 were required to ferry the battered survivors back to Norway. The verdict was undeniable. Viking dominance had reached its twilight. Their dragon-proud vessels would return, but their fire had faded. Harald Hardrada's fall at Stamford Bridge didn't just end a military bid. It sealed the end of an epic. The Viking era, bloody, daring, gold-hungry, was officially over. And aptly, it ended with a Viking king perishing far from his homeland, sword drawn, lungs choking on blood. Yet the aftermath echoed beyond that meadow. Days later, Harold Godwin's son had no time to rest. As Norse remnants retreated, he learned of another landing in the south. William of Normandy. Had Harold not struck north when he did, he might have better braced for the second wave. Instead, barely 3 weeks after smashing one foe, he had to meet another. At Hastings on October 14th, Harold died to Norman blades, and England changed hands. In a strange twist, the Viking Harold, who failed to seize England, may have cleared the path for William's triumph. The Havoc Harold cause up north weakened the realm just enough to crack it open. Back in Norway, the news struck like sleet. The legendary Harold, hero of Russ, scourge of Byzantium, proud monarch, was gone. His son Olaf Kyrre inherited the crown. But Olaf was no Harold. He ruled softly, favoring diplomacy over pillage. Under his rule, Norway found stability. Viking fire cooled into politics, commerce, and faith. The ships remained, but now bore cargo instead of warriors. No more wild men storming abbeys. No more gods thirsting for shore-bound sacrifice. No more kings dreaming of plunder across the horizon. The sagas would still echo, but their heroes had become shades. Harold's life was the last grand saga of the Viking Age. From icy fjords to Constantinople's domes, from steppes to English fields, he embodied all the era's spirit. Bravery, hunger, cruelty, and above all, motion. But at Stamford Bridge, that motion ceased, and the Norse world looked inward. The Viking epic was over. The Middle Ages had begun. Harald Hardrada's fall marked the Viking twilight, but his shadow outlived him. Even centuries on, his tale reverberates through chronicles, songs, and legend like a war horn over a fjord. He wasn't merely a ruler. He symbolized the final surge of Norse ambition and the defiance of fading into history. Scholars still debate who Harold truly was. Raider, ruler, artist, murderer? The truth sits between. He composed poetry but unleashed fire on towns. He raised churches, but also soaked field from Sicily to England with blood. He was brute and bard, creator and ruin, but all agree he was great. No Viking traveled farther, battled more foes, or gained as much glory as Harold. He served emperors, defied monarchs, and commanded vast legions. While most Norse chiefs vanished with their songs and mugs, Harold etched his legacy across 3 realms. His verses endure. His name rings in the Heimskringla and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. His feats still test modern storytellers trying to capture a man who lived 3 lives in one. Even his name, Hardrada, the hard ruler, spoke volumes. Not a slur, a warning. Harold didn't yield. He led and fought with heat in his chest and steel in his grip. After his death, Norway changed course. Olaf Kyrre, his son, brought peace and growth. Trade thrived. Sword resheathed. The Viking world became memory. Yet Harold loomed larger than death. In Norway, a legend. In Iceland, a saga. In England, a grim reminder. In Byzantium, a northern ghost who once stood sentinel for emperors. He was a final Viking king, and he met his end as he had lived, sword raised, chasing kingship. When longships stopped sailing and mead halls went silent, the world moved on. But Harold Hardrada had already ensured his name would never vanish. To the Norse, a ship wasn't just wood, rivets, and canvas. It was soul, heritage, and fate. It was how one explored, how one warred, and how one departed. So when a warrior died, placing him in a ship wasn't for show. It was sacred. Vikings believed ships bridged the mortal world and the hereafter. Just as a warrior crossed oceans in life to raid and rule, he'd now crossed the unseen sea toward eternity. This wasn't just old lore. It was law. Life was a voyage. Death, simply its next phase. That's why these burials were so grand. The vessel itself had to be worthy. These were long ships, up to 70 feet in length, with dragon-headed prows, built not only to slice through waves, but, it seems, spiritual dimensions as well. The body was placed at the center, often on a bed or pile of furs. Then mourners surrounded it, not with grief alone, but with gifts. Weapons, of course, sword, axe, shield, spear, for combat in the afterlife. But also tools, garments, jewelry, and more disturbingly slaves, horses, even hawks, all sacrificed to follow their master into death, as they had in life. To us, this seems barbaric. To the Vikings, it was dignity. Then they buried the ship beneath tons of soil, forming a mound, both a grave and a monument. These were no ordinary burials. They proclaimed power. Here was someone who earned a vessel for the voyage to beyond. And not only men received this honor. Some of the grandest ship graves, like the Osberg burial, belonged to women. Viking queens, priestesses, noble women. They too were laid to rest with ships and treasure, proof that spiritual passage wasn't reserved for warriors alone. So yes, when we say the Vikings lived and died by the sea, we mean that literally. The ship wasn't just a way to raid. It was a way to transcend death. If this sounds mythical, the Osberg and Gokstad discoveries turned legend into reality. These weren't crumbling grave pits. They were time capsules. Entire ships unearthed from Norwegian earth, intact, majestic, brimming with wonder, splendor, and the unmistakable scent of legacy. Consider the Osberg ship, discovered in 1904. Farmers digging near a mound in southeast Norway didn't expect to hit a 70-foot dragon-headed vessel. But there it was, preserved beneath the clay, almost untouched. The prow curled upward in an elegant serpentine arc, its surface carved in exquisite detail. The craftsmanship was stunning. This wasn't a warship. It was ceremonial, a royal hearse for someone extraordinary. And here's the surprise. 2 women lay inside, one older, likely a noblewoman or ruler, the other younger, perhaps a servant or possibly a priestess. The elder may have been a queen or a powerful vulva, a Norse seeress. She was draped in silk and wool, surrounded by carved sleds, ornate chests, animal remains, and even a cart with wheels as elaborate as stained glass. 2 sacrificed oxen were laid at the prow. This was no quiet farewell. It was a cosmic departure. Then there was a Gokstad ship, uncovered in 1880, sleeker, faster, and clearly built for battle. Inside lay the skeleton of a man in his 40s, likely a chieftain or warrior king. His exact identity remains unknown, but his burial was anything but humble. Shields lined the hull. Around him lay beds, weapons, gaming pieces, and the remains of 12 horses, 6 dogs, and astonishingly 2 peacocks. Yes, peacocks. These ship burials revealed more than wealth. They revealed values. The Osberg site whispered of ritual and feminine power. The Gokstad site shouted conquest, prestige, and far-reaching trade. Together, they revealed how Vikings viewed death as a journey. The next world wasn't a passive end. It was a destination, and ships were the vessel to get there. These were no ordinary graves. These were statements, echoes of might, temples that would bury beneath the soil. And they were just the start. A Viking funeral wasn't simply a farewell. It was spectacle, a bold, symbolic rite of passage meant to launch the dead toward the next world and etch their name into eternity. Ship burials were the main attraction. It began with the body. The dead weren't simply tossed onto a pyre. They were clean, dressed in their finest, silk, if available, or finely woven wool, and adorned with symbols of status, brooches, beads, rings. Some were arranged to look as though sleeping peacefully, clutching a weapon, or sitting upright in a ceremonial pose. Then came the rituals, and here things took a dark turn. Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan's account offers a chilling look into Viking funeral customs, particularly among the Rus, Norse traders in Eastern Europe. In one telling, when a chieftain died, a slave girl either volunteered or was chosen to accompany him. Over several days, she was treated like royalty, bathed, clothed, paraded. Then, during the funeral, she was ritually slain, strangled and stabbed, in a grisly rite involving chanting, drums, and intoxicated frenzy. Animals met similar fates. Horses were butchered to carry the soul. Dogs, cows, even hawks were sacrificed as companions or guardians. In some cases, ships were encircled by ringed stones, thought to mark the boundary between this world and the next. And the ship itself? Not always buried whole. Sometimes it was burned, set ablaze, and pushed out to sea in a fiery send-off that lit up the night. Other times it was buried in a dug-out trench, then covered with stone or soil to create a burial mound. The decision depended on factors like status, region, and sheer practicality. After all, burning a ship wasn't cheap. These funerals were spiritual, yes, but also political. A grand burial was a message. This was no common man. His death rippled through the world. His journey to the gods deserved thunder. Ship burials were violent, majestic, and deeply sacred. They didn't send the dead away. They launched them like stars across the firmament. Thanks to Hollywood, most imagine a Viking funeral the same way. A burning ship drifting into twilight, flames soaring while mourners watch from the beach. It's dramatic, cinematic, but mostly myth. So what's real? The truth is, burning ships were rare. Archaeology reveals that burials, like those at Osberg, Gokstad, and Thun, were more common. Long ships were placed in the ground, filled with grave goods, then sealed under mounds. These weren't uniform either. Some ship graves were lavish, others simple, but the goal was preservation. The ship wasn't destroyed. It was sanctified, transformed into a vessel of remembrance. So where did the flaming send-off come from? That iconic image largely comes from the Icelandic sagas and epic literature. We rely heavily on outsider records. Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, for instance, described a Rus funeral in which a chieftain's body was burned aboard a ship alongside sacrifice victims. But even that isn't straightforward. It might not have been a real ship, but a symbolic structure made to resemble one. Ship burnings likely occurred, particularly in places where burial was difficult or where fire had spiritual significance. Cremation at sea made sense when land was scarce or when one was meant to ascend to the gods in dramatic fashion. But archaeologically speaking, burned ships are extremely rare. In fact, the concept of a burning ship may have been as meaningful as the ritual itself. Fire held deep sacred meaning for Norse people. It cleansed. It changed. A burning vessel wasn't only a show. It was a sacred passageway, carrying the soul and smoke to the divine. Burial, however, offered permanence. It gave legacy shape. It left a site to return to, a mound-marked memory and honor. And in a culture built on sagas and bloodlines, that meant everything. So which one was real? Both were, but the buried ships left behind remains. The burned ones? They vanished into legend and flame. Dismiss the image of Viking women sitting home by the fire. In death, as in life, Norse women could be formidable, even revered. Their ship burials prove it, sometimes exceeding those of men. The Osberg burial is the most vivid case. Found in 1904, it contained 2 women, one older, one younger, laid within one of the grandest Viking ships ever unearthed. The vessel was stunning, ornate carvings, dragon heads, and royal craftsmanship. Yet it wasn't a warrior's tomb. It was for a queen, or perhaps a vulva. A vulva was a seeress, a spiritual leader who bridged realms. Oseberg artifacts, wands, staffs, and ritual animal parts suggest magic. If she was a vulva, then this was more than royal tribute. It was sacred honor. In Norse culture, spiritual power rivaled martial prowess. Then there's a wealth. Carts, sledges, tapestries, silks, animal sacrifices, and ceremonial beds, all suggesting these women were meant to rule the next world as they had this one. Other graves across Scandinavia echo this. The Gausel Queen, near Stavanger, was buried with gold, foreign bronze, and elite riding gear. Her status was unquestionable. The Ladby ship suggests another high-ranking woman's grave, and scholars still debate whether weapon-filled warrior graves belong to females. In one from Birka, Sweden, DNA revealed a military leader buried with weapons was genetically female. What does this show? Viking women held power, and they kept it in death. As queens, priestesses, aristocrats, or shield maidens, they weren't just buried alongside kings. They were sometimes the kings. Viking burials weren't solitary. The dead traveled with items for the afterlife, a curated set of possessions that reflected their needs, rank, and soul. But it wasn't only riches and blades. These ships were cultural time capsules, intimate portraits of Viking life and death. Let's start with arms. Nearly all elite burials include them: swords with ornate hilts, shields, axes, and spears. But they weren't simply tools for ghostly battles in Valhalla. They spoke. A sword meant honor and status. Some were bent or broken before burial, not an insult, but as a ritual, freeing the weapon to follow its owner. Yet, not everything was martial. Many everyday objects were included: cooking pots, grooming tools, whetstones, and board games. The afterlife, evidently, wasn't endless war. The dead might still cook, clean up, or enjoy a quick round in the Fatiful while awaiting Ragnarok. Then came the animals, many of them. In the Gokstad ship, archaeologists found remains of 12 horses, 8 dogs, and 2 peacocks. Yes, peacocks. Horses were soul carriers. Dogs offered companionship. The peacocks? Perhaps symbols of prestige or final flamboyance. The most jarring offerings were human. Slaves or servants were sometimes sacrificed to join their master's voyage. Whether they volunteered or not is unclear, but their presence says much about Viking ideas of service beyond life. Every burial item had meaning. It painted a picture. This one wielded power. That one loved silk. That one hunted. Another ruled. Grave goods were no random pile. They were final biography etched in gold, iron, and bone. And once sealed, the ship became a house beneath the soil. While Viking ship burials often evoke Norway's fjords, the practice stretched far and wide. From the Arctic north to the Slavic river routes, these rites varied by region, shaped by land, beliefs, and social hierarchy. Begin with Norway, home of Oseberg and Gokstad. These burials were majestic, ships sealed in mounds with nobles and monarchs. Norway's terrain preserved wood and treasure exceptionally well. These were showpieces with mythic imagery and immense scale. They weren't about hiding the dead, but showcasing them. In Sweden, burials looked different. At Vendel and Valsgard, entire ships weren't always used. Sometimes stones outlined ship shapes, like skeletal shadows on earth. These often held cremated remains in urns or scattered inside the rock boundary. Sweden embraced a symbolic fusion of flame and stone, potent yet without massive mounds. And then we reached the Rus, the Norse-descended warriors and merchants who settled along rivers of today's Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Ibn Fadlan witnessed one such burial on the Volga, a dramatic ship burning. Though physical evidence of full ships in the East is rarer, cremation mounds and grave goods show continuity and belief. Death is a journey, a transformation, and performance. In Denmark, the evidence for ship burials is more incomplete. The wet, marshy soil is unfriendly to preserving wood, meaning fewer graves have survived. But stone ship outlines and rich graves with maritime symbols suggest that the practice endured, even if in subtler forms. In places like Scotland, Ireland, and the Baltic, we still find boat-shaped graves, sometimes actual boats, sometimes just stones arranged in that iconic form. Wherever the Vikings went, they brought with them the belief that a ship was the ultimate vessel, not just over oceans, but through time and into death. Ship burials weren't rigid rituals. They changed, evolved, but their core meaning held. No one walked to the afterlife. They sailed. For the Vikings, death wasn't a full stop. It was a voyage. That belief is what gives these burials such gravity. They weren't just about prestige or wealth. They reflected a deep mythic worldview where dying meant travel, and every soul needed a ship. In Norse mythology, water shaped the universe. From the oceans circling Midgard to the rivers dividing worlds, everything was liquid. Life came from the sea, and so did death. It's no accident that ships appear again and again in Viking lore, not just as war tools, but as spiritual vehicles. Take Naglfar, the ship built from dead men's fingernails, which sails during Ragnarok to bring destruction to the gods. Or Splenir, the magical ship of the goddess Freya, which would be folded and carried in a pocket, yet always caught the wind. These were more than tales. They inspired real-life rituals. Each longship burial was a story made solid, a blending of fable and funeral. To be laid to rest in a ship was to embark, maybe to Valhalla, the grand hall where brave warriors feasted forever, maybe to Folkvang, Freya's meadow for the worthy, or perhaps to Hell, the dim land ruled by the goddess of decay. No matter where your soul was headed, it wouldn't walk, it would sail, and ship burials weren't reserved just for the elite. Even modest cremations often included boat-like markers of stone or timber, hinting at the same journey. The vessel was more than metaphor. It was a spiritual vehicle cutting through both sea and spirit realms. These funerals weren't just ceremonies. They were cosmic launchings. By placing the dead inside a ship, flanked by weapons, animals, and riches, the mourners weren't sealing a tomb. They were provisioning a traveler. This was someone on the brink of crossing between Midgard and whatever lay beyond. For those left behind, the ship wasn't a final farewell. It was a send-off, a sign that the voyage continued. It had simply changed course. It's been over 1,000 years since the last Viking ship burial disappeared beneath the earth, yet their echoes still resound. What was once interred in silence now speaks through museums, excavations, and popular imagination. Today, ships like Oseberg, Gokstad, and Thun rest behind glass in Norway. They aren't seen as morbid curiosities, but as cultural jewels. Tourists stand in awe before their arched prows, taking the craftsmanship, the iconography, and the sheer boldness of a people who made a coffin into a boat and a grave into a portal. These ships were never meant to sail again, yet they have, not over water, but through centuries. And the fascination hasn't faded. Writers, directors, and game designers keep turning to Viking funerals for inspiration. From fiery farewells in The 13th Warrior to animated tributes in How to Train Your Dragon, the ship burial has become a defining image of Norse culture. Is it always accurate? Not quite, but the core survives. Death as journey, ship as symbol, and even now many modern Scandinavians feel its pull. Some Viking descendants request sea burials or ceremonies inspired by their ancestors, minus the slaves, of course, but rich in symbolism. Some even build burial ship replicas, launching them on rivers to better understand engineering and the enchantment of the past. What's astonishing is just how much these ships have taught us. Their timber speaks of ancient forests now vanished. Their construction techniques rival the engineering of the Mediterranean. Their grave goods, from silk to silver, even exotic birds, map a Viking world that reached far beyond Scandinavia. A ship burial was more than a final rest. It was a final act, a spectacle of trade, conquest, and storytelling. And even now, the performance continues. These ships remind us that the dead once lived, that legends and memory intertwine, and that some vessels don't stop sailing. They just find new oceans. Courtly love wasn't about marriage, children, or stability. It was about yearning and possibility, and a strange combination of agony and bliss. By the 12th century, it was so fashionable among nobles that it had developed its own code, part love manual, part philosophical test, all out of sync with real life. Emerging from the courts of southern France, especially Aquitaine, courtly love wasn't about real passion. It was about performance. Nobles, especially knights, would pledge themselves to a lady, often someone already married or above them in rank. But the aim wasn't to win her heart. It was to adore her from afar. A knight might write poetry, brave dangers in her name, and suffer silently. If it sounds like arm or heartbreak, that's because it was. The rules were strict. Love must be hidden. It had to be hard. And it could never be truly fulfilled, because once love was satisfied, it lost its sacredness. In this worldview, pain was a point. A knight's sorrow proved his sincerity. The more hopeless the love, the more noble the lover. This idea merged with the ideals of chivalry, the knightly virtues of courage, service, and humility. The perfect knight was fearless in battle and reverent before his lady. Love didn't weaken him. It tested him. A knight who could ache without breaking his code was the ultimate hero. And yet, courtly love was full of contradictions. While a knight wrote verses about his lady's beauty and unattainability, her arranged marriage continued uninterrupted. While the code celebrated restraint and purity, history is full of scandals, affairs, and duels sparked by these noble devotions. Still, the idea caught fire. Poets, troubadours, and performers turned it into an industry, crafting tales of suffering knights, weeping ladies, and the unending ache of unfulfilled longing. Fantasy or not, courtly love reshaped how medieval Europe thought about love, gender, and power. Passion wasn't just feeling, it became a discipline. Before sonnets and Shakespeare, there were troubadours, roaming poets and musicians who turned unreachable love into art. These weren't farmers singing about beer and sheep. They were usually nobles, educated, multilingual, and fully aware of the risks of praising another man's wife. The troubadour movement began in Occitania, a region of southern France, in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Their songs, composed in Occitan, a Romance language, always returned to one theme: forbidden love. A knight hopelessly devoted to a noble lady. A woman bound by marriage, adored in secret. It was elegant suffering. Their songs weren't sung in taverns, but in castle halls, before lords and ladies who heard their own hidden feelings in the lyrics. A skilled troubadour could make a countess blush with a metaphor. A brilliant one could spark gossip that lasted decades. They developed a whole language for love, called finamore or refined love. It wasn't lust. It was admiration, self-control, and inner torment. To them, love was meant to ache. The lady was idealized, almost divine and unreachable. The man, often a knight or poet, would prove his devotion through service, suffering, and soul-laid lyricism. Some famed troubadours were actual historical figures. G.A. Rudel, who swore he'd fallen for a woman he never met. Bernard de Venedorn, who spun heartbreak into hits. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, an arts patron who likely inspired many of these songs, and may have lived them, too. Troubadours didn't just invent medieval love songs. They sparked the idea that expressing love through art was noble, even divine. Their influence spread widely, birthing the Dolce Stil Novo in Italy, the Menzingers in Germany, and traditions across England. What they launched was bigger than music. It became a cultural obsession shaping how love was composed, sung, and romanticized for centuries. They didn't just sing for the court. They instructed the court in how to love. In courtly love, the woman was everything: muse, judge, goddess, and unattainable goal. She stood on a pedestal, sometimes real, always symbolic, worshipped by knights and honored in verse. But such glorification wasn't always empowering. Flattering, yes, yet confining, an ideal impossible to meet. The romantic lady was usually noble, married, and inaccessible, and that was essential. The more distant she was, the purer the love appeared. Her beauty was painted in impossible prose: skin of ivory, starry eyes, hair like golden thread. Yet she wasn't described as a real woman. She was a symbol, crafted to evoke devotion and pain in equal parts. For men, that ideal granted a noble outlet for emotional expression. A knight could sigh, cry, or compose verses without shame, because his sacred love excused a vulnerability. But for women, this ideal was a trap. They were expected to inspire love, never return it. They had to remain graceful, virtuous, and composed, while being admired, desired, and sometimes followed by ballad-bearing suitors. Occasionally, the lady held symbolic power. Some stories made her the one issuing tests, commanding loyalty or judging devotion. But real power was rare. Most noble women lived under strict control, often wed for politics by age 15. Yet courtly love offered a rare gift: visibility. In a world ruled by men's voices, courtly love placed women center stage. They became subjects of ballads, motives for quests, and hearts of romantic myth. Some women mastered the game. Figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie of Champagne weren't just muses. They funded poets, guided romantic ideals, and sometimes infused them with political undertones. Still, courtly love was not about equality. It thrived on longing and distance. The lady was adored, but seldom known. A fantasy in a crown, and fantasies don't speak. Chivalry began as combat code: loyalty to lord, courage in battle, mercy to foes. But when courtly love slipped under the armor, chivalry softened. A lance thrust, a sworn oath, a gleaming spur. Each became a gesture of affection. A knight no longer fought just for a king or country. He fought for a smile, or the mere mention of a smile from afar. The courtly knight served three loyalties: first, God, with prayers at dawn; second, his liege, through war and fealty; third, his lady, the unseen light behind each act. Where once flew battle flags, now a ribbon, veil, or sleeve might be tied to an arm, not for concealment, but declaration. His blade bore a personal pledge. Tournaments, once mere mock battles, became romantic theater. The jousting field flew with colors, and each knight announced whose favor he wore. Victory wasn't just martial glory, it was proof of devotion. Some knights reportedly fainted from fatigue before retreating, lest they seemed less dedicated than rivals. Such devotion demanded ascetic discipline. Texts like Andreas Capellanus' De Amore taught that true lovers stayed humble, gentle, and secretive. He must guard her honor above his life, endure jealousy in silence, and cruelest of all, serve joyfully even if love stayed unreturned. The suffering was a proof. Yet beneath the velvet lines lay iron truth. Castles needed guards, roads held danger, and crusades called. Knights wrote verses at night, but sharpened swords by dawn. The same hands that inked a rondo might cleave a helm hours later. Medieval observers saw the contradiction, but that paradox was the point. The sharper the contrast between violence and grace, the nobler the knight. Of course, real feelings strained the rules. Affairs bloomed, scandals broke, reputations shattered. Still, the ideal persisted, a dream where valor bowed to beauty. In a harsh world of battles and arranged unions, this dream was intoxicating. And so chivalry, ironclad but scented with longing, became the romance code of nobility. Fight fiercely, love fiercely, but only from afar and in rhyme. Every code begs to be broken, and courtly love, with its secrecy and longing, almost demanded it. Beneath the poetry and pageantry burned real desires. When fantasy stepped off the parchment, it sparked some of medieval Europe's juiciest scandals. Take Peter Abelard and Heloise. Abelard was Europe's philosophical star. Heloise, his young genius pupil. It began like courtly legend. Lessons turned into lines, glances into poems, until it turned very real, very intimate, and disastrously public. The backlash was savage. An enraged uncle, a hidden child, a forced union, Abelard's infamous castration, and both lovers ending in monastic life, exchanging letters full of faith and agony. Courtly ideals offered exalted devotion. Reality delivered suffering and silence. Even royalty wasn't safe. Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of the troubadours, was rumored to flirt freely, most scandalously with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers during the Second Crusade. True or not, gossip fueled her divorce from Louis VII, and rewrote Europe's future when she married Henry Plantagenet. Love songs could shake kingdoms. Even princesses weren't immune. In the 1314 Tour de Nesle scandal, 3 French royal women were accused, sparked by a servant's gossip, of secret trysts in a Parisian tower. 2 royal marriages were annulled. The supposed lovers, skinned and hanged. The disgraced princesses spent years locked in convent prisons. Chivalric tales praised female virtue, but when virtue cracked, the justice system had chains ready. Then came the quieter downfalls. Unnamed ladies exiled to remote estates for exchanging letters. Knights sent on crusade as penance for suspected dalliance. Abbots preaching sermons comparing straying hearts to rusted swords. The church never banned courtly love outright, but ecclesiastical courts handed down many fines for excessive familiarity. A reminder that, for all its poetry, passion still violated canon law. These episodes laid bare the tension at the heart of chivalric romance, the celebration of forbidden longing within a society determined to punish it. The same world that honored a knight's longing demanded he never consummate it. When vows failed, reputations burned, sometimes literally. The dream of elegant devotion often shattered against the stone walls of medieval authority. Courtly love inspired poems, but it also destroyed lives, and each scandal only fueled the appeal of the next secret affair. Because no tale of love is sweeter than one spiced with danger. If troubadours provided the soundtrack to courtly love, medieval writers built its cinematic universe. Starting in the late 12th century, authors like Chrétien de Troyes transformed the raw elements of secrecy, longing, and emotional torment into full-blown narrative epics, where love wasn't background. It was the plot itself. Enter King Arthur's court, the mythic stage for every romantic quandary. In Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien revealed the ultimate courtly triangle. The perfect Queen Guinevere, her noble but detached husband Arthur, and the gallant yet doomed Sir Lancelot. Lancelot achieves incredible feats, crossing sword bridges, defeating armies, but his greatest test is internal, loving a woman he can never claim. Chrétien packed the story with every courtly trope, secret tokens, forbidden meetings, and the ever-looming threat of disgrace. Readers were enthralled. Knights aspired to be Lancelot, just without the lifetime of adultery. Arthurian tales soon spread across Europe. In Germany, Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote Parzival, where spiritual growth depended on learning restraint in love. In England, sprawling cycles emerged, the the Vulgate, the Post-Vulgate, and finally Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century L'Ile Morte d'Arthur, which codified Arthurian tragedy into Western canon. Love as triumph, love as tragedy. Not all romances war steel. Around 1230, Guillaume de Loris began the Romance of the Rose, a dream allegory in which the beloved rose is locked in a walled garden, and courtly virtues, courtesy, pity, humility, appear as human figures. 40 years later, Jean de Meun expanded it with biting satire, mocking priests, nobles, and love's sacred code. The poem became a bestseller of the Middle Ages, copied hundreds of times, and debated in lecture halls. Was it sacred guide or scandalous parody? Whatever the verdict, these texts shaped the grammar of desire. Metaphors, love as a flame, longing as servitude, the beloved as sunlight, became cliches precisely because writers and lovers used them endlessly. Even real-life courts borrowed them as etiquette. How to bow, how to pine, how to flatter with perfect despair. Literary romance played a double role. It glorified the ideals that troubadours sang, heroism in love's name, while also revealing the contradictions within. Fiction made courtly love feel grander than reality. So even those who never met a troubadour still learned how to yearn beautifully. But the church took notice. As songs drifted over castle walls, bishops sniffed sin. How could a culture that idolized adultery, vanity, and polished lust coexist with Christianity's demand for chastity and humility? Spoiler, it couldn't, not peacefully. Preachers responded first. By the 13th century, sermon manuals like Jacques de Vitry's exemplar warned against knights who entered tournaments for a lady's favor and returned damned. The Dominican Stephen of Bourbon called troubadours corrupters of virtue and order. Moralists coined a more de règle, disordered love, to contrast sanctioned marital affection from the poetic fever of courtly desire. Church courts followed suit. A knight caught giving a love token during Lent might be ordered to walk barefoot to a shrine or buy church candles, a literal fee for figurative fire. Priests were told to interrogate confessions for signs of secret romance, suspicious poetry, even daydreams. Longing itself became taxable in prayers, but repression met resistance. The same aristocrats funding monasteries also paid poets. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Marie de Champagne, Blanche of Castile, devotees of both abbeys and love verse. Bishops could denounce poetry on Sunday and dine with a poetry-loving duchess by Tuesday. So excommunications were mostly for show. Real control came through adaptation. Some clerics used wit over wrath. Andreas Capellanus' De Amore, allegedly commissioned by Marie de Champagne, outlines 31 rules of love, then ends by dismissing the whole affair as sinful foolishness, a mirror that flatters, then distorts. Satirists piled on. The Romance of the Rose, especially Jean de Meun's continuation, mocked romantic seduction. Jealous husbands lurked, nurses schemed, and virtue always cracked. The poem entered university syllabi. It was proof. Mockery could cut deeper than damnation. Despite opposition, courtly love endured, because it gave something sermons didn't: drama. People don't trade theater for lectures. The church slowed the fever, pruned the excess, but couldn't kill the yearning itself. By the 14th century, moralists still thundered, but the troubadour's legacy was woven into Europe's cultural DNA. Cupid, chastened, strummed more softly, glancing nervously toward the pulpit. By the mid-14th century, courtly love's shimmer was fading. War, plague, and rising merchant classes cracked the class divisions that once made distant desire feel noble. Knights became mercenaries. Troubadours competed with traveling minstrels. Europe, devastated by the Black Death, turned from silk and sighs to sackcloth and survival. Still, the love language lingered. It evolved, became subtler. Courtesy books, like the Book of the Courtier, 1528, by Baldassare Castiglione, translated chivalric gestures for Renaissance salons. Instead of bleeding at her window, the ideal courtier displayed sprezzatura, effortless elegance in dancing, witty talk, and veiled admiration. Longing remained. Desperation simply became grace.